The first game where I really focused on how you and I make builds was Warframe, but now I've covered a lot more build systems in a lot more games in my videos and streams over the past few years. That's put Warframe into a bit more perspective. Well, actually, it's mostly been what I've heard from all of you that's given me many new perspectives. Most of the builds you're seeing me play here are recommendations from all of you, either during Twitch streams or on my Discord, or some of them are from the comments. A lot of these games were originally recommended by all of you as well, and that has changed how I think about making builds, and indeed about Warframe. So a pretty simple idea for this video. These are 3 things which could be what you love or what you hate about making builds in Warframe. And I didn't really see them this way until I played lots of other games' build systems. I originally thought of each of these things as being just good or bad, but now that I have a broader perspective, thanks to all of you, I've noticed that there are some pretty interesting trade-offs for each of these game mechanics, or really I think Warframe takes the middle road a lot of the time. Number 1, many decision points. You have a lot of different weapon slots and many mods, so an individual change to your loadout is often relatively small. Warframe just has a lot of different places where you can make a build in some form as well. Think Archon shards or focus or, etc. That could be seen as a good thing in that you could tweak small details and customize, for example, your ability stats to get exact amounts of strength or duration and such. To some extent, the ability to make changes like what I'm talking about here is probably how some of you would define making a build in general. So keep in mind that I'm saying I think Warframe has an unusually large amount of decision points. Merely having decision points is unremarkable. A lot of games have a build system, I guess. I'm referring to one that I think is significant and certainly weird, which I think Warframe's is. And then yeah, it could be seen as a bad thing in that you often need to make quite a few changes to actually notice anything during gameplay, or some abilities don't feel very good until they're modded. So though the premise of the system is that you can modify abilities, to some extent it feels like you need to complete abilities in some cases. Or even if a single mod has a huge impact, that one mod can take quite a lot of resources to acquire or level up. So needing many of them to make a change or having small granular changes, that can add up. Another way to look at the bad side of these small changes is that a large number of the mods or decision points on a given build are just there to get it to work. They aren't necessarily creating any specific gameplay experience. Think base damage mods. Here you can see me building out a weapon for which this is especially true. And some of these mod slots, I'm choosing what element I want, or to a lesser extent, what kind of supplementary damage I want, like punch through or fire rate or something. But the base damage mod slots, not so much. Base damage mods themselves may seem good or bad to you. To some players, they're welcome as clearly strong options when they fill a role, and then they kind of get the damage situation out of the way so the player can focus on what they want to add. And to other players, having something that's obviously good seems inherently pointless. Why do we need to supposedly choose these options if they're basically always good? Of course, you can get your base damage other ways, but you get the idea. That might seem boring to some players exactly because those options are fairly obviously good most of the time, but that serves many purposes. A bigger way to look at this is just that Warframe is using the modding system for multiple goals, and so it doesn't fully fulfill any one of them. You could, and people have, made videos on the subject of whether that's a flawed piece of design or how you might change it, but I'd like to add that this video isn't really meant to be a critique of Warframe. I think very few games really prioritize the experience of making builds. It's often just a thing that exists rather than a game's focus, and that's not bad, that's just the game is focused on different things. And I do think Warframe is making a lot of compromises rather than maximizing certain pieces of design. I know that really sounded like a criticism before. Sure, I don't prefer that approach, but that isn't noteworthy. Most games do that. I just think it's interesting how some of the very same things that might make Warframe fun for someone could also be what another person dislikes, even if they both generally enjoy something appreciably similar that they'd both call making builds. If this video helps you figure out what you prefer, that's excellent. I also hope you'll acknowledge others' preferences and we'll all understand each other better. I know this sure benefited me. Anyway, one higher level good and bad thing about lots of smaller changes in Warframe is that you can make a good build, but you also kind of must make a reasonably good build, right? Put mods on weapons to do damage at higher levels. And due to a build being made up of lots of smaller choices in Warframe, if you feel you must make a build, that might take quite a bit of undesired effort compared to a game with a leaner build system. Making a build is kind of like doing the last little bit of game design yourself, or the developers sort of allowing you to fill in your preferences and then get a certain type of experience that you'd prefer. Of course, then the catch is that they do have to think about what to do if the player doesn't fill in their preference. The player might not wish to set their preferences, or they might just not know what they are yet. I don't personally think automod is a full solution here, but automod has been updated, and in theory this kind of addresses the issue. So that was automod on this weapon, and you got to see my build before. You make it that way you will. A given player might want to choose various weapons, but not find the process of modding those weapons that interesting, and I think that would ideally be fine. Choosing the weapons you like doesn't seem particularly more or less build crafty than choosing mods to me. But nesting the systems so that weapons don't really do much at many levels of play without mods kind of bundles those things together so you can't as easily just enjoy one. Warframe, like a lot of games, has a lot of variety, but the systems are kind of, again, nested in such a way that it's difficult to simply enjoy one of those systems. You generally have to do almost everything in Warframe to do any of the things in Warframe. You could imagine that for some people, that this exact blend of elements is a good thing. Maybe to some people, this is a good amount of each individual bit, and they are interested in a little bit of everything. Say, someone who isn't as focused on the build making, and therefore a little slice of various different approaches to a build system might be appealing, since they aren't there specifically for totally free choice or totally open customization. Again, to be more specific, maybe to that type of player, having a few mods that are really obvious choices, but then some that are a little less obvious, is a good mix. As I said before, this isn't a critique of Warframe necessarily. It seems like maybe this works well for Warframe generally, but I don't imagine it works that well if you have a specific preference for making builds, and that's what I'm interested in here. Lastly, it's come to my attention that a lot of people consider lots of decision points to be the defining trait of a build system, and I'd like to add a counterpoint. I think the quality or impact of each decision matters a lot too. One extreme end of the spectrum here would be something like Pyre, where you have only 4 talent points and the ability to equip just one item for each character, but each choice almost completely changes how the character plays. Good because each choice has tons of impact, maybe not so good because there are fewer possible total options, a lot fewer. Maybe it doesn't feel as personal, but I think this is clearly a robust system. Okay, lots of small decision points. I think this is a distinct aspect of Warframe. This particular ratio isn't something I've encountered in a lot of other games. There are games you might think of as having more decision points. Maybe, say, Path of Exile is a simple example. This is just a janky slice of the passive skill tree. But, well, to me anyway, it doesn't feel like there are as many distinct systems or spaces to get a given option as there are in Warframe. I think more options often means less opportunity cost, like less limitations on having it all in your build, but Warframe, I think, has especially low opportunity cost, even compared to games with even more options. In Warframe, you can often just have every single effect that would be relevant to your build. You don't often have to give up much. Again, great for getting what you want to make your build exactly how you like it. Maybe not great if you want limitations which lead to many distinct builds. Number 2, very strong generalist options / wide difficulty range. I don't know, intertitles are hard. You know, when you get a weapon in Warframe, it's pretty good on most possible loadouts. Most things in Warframe are either good most of the time or bad all of the time. In many other games, few options are really great most of the time. You might ask why you'd bother with a lot of different options if so many of them are usually very good. Whether viability, how good things are, is even relevant to a discussion about making builds may be up for debate for some of you. For many players, how good something is matters much less than it does for other players, but being able to complete the game's content does require some baseline level of viability, so most of you would probably agree it's not completely irrelevant how strong things are, even if that's not your primary concern. A way I like to think about this that I've found helpful is that most people, even people that feel really focused on the game's difficulty or the power level of items in the game, I like to think of everyone as kind of looking for what is powerful enough And for some people, the threshold is low enough that it appears as if it is irrelevant how strong things are. But I've rarely encountered people who truly care not at all about how effective something is. It's just that to them, effective enough is a lot lower threshold. So it seems like they're okay with things that have very different power levels. People who want a much higher power level, well, it's not enough for their particular threshold or what they consider to be efficient or effective until it gets much higher. That makes sense too. And so it seems like they only care about how much damage something does, and they might, but some people are still interested in the variety that these weapons have. It's just that their desire or their sensibility for how strong something has to be to feel viable is different or higher. And so it seems like that's something they prioritize more. And so the issue with lots of generally good options could be that if you care about the interesting merits and drawbacks of different weapons, this means there really aren't many merits or drawbacks specific to most weapons. To put it another way, there's little gameplay reason to choose one option over another, or if you're focused on gameplay benefits, there's little reason to choose just about anything except some obviously much more powerful option if your threshold for what feels strong enough is rather high. This may be a huge benefit for some types of players, though. If you like how a weapon feels to use, it's very often viable enough to complete the rewarding content, and there very often isn't much benefit to using something else other than more easily completing the rewarding content. An example I like to use in Warframe is the mobile defense mission type. So you can see here, I can't do anything to complete this faster. Once you do enough damage that enemies are dead or you can keep them away from the defensive objective, more damage arguably doesn't do anything. And obviously exactly what amount of damage will achieve that depends on a few things. Player skill, playstyle, the number of players in the mission, what the weapon is, exactly how it's doing damage, what the level of difficulty is, of course. But the point is, it doesn't mean everything is as good as everything else. Some weapons are way stronger than others if you're in a situation where that does something. But that does and doesn't matter at different times to different players. Furthermore, in Warframe, since most weapons aren't very specifically good in only a limited number of situations, it's hard to make weapons have their own unique merits. To make them feel balanced, all you can really do is try to get their damage very similarly high, so they all feel strong. And not only that, Warframe's modding system magnifies small differences between weapons by many times. A fully modded weapon in Warframe does over 10 times the damage it did unmodded. Many games with similar modding systems, you don't increase a weapon's damage by so many orders of magnitude. Because you do in Warframe, unless weapons have nearly exactly the same damage output at base, a small difference in base damage may be surprisingly noticeable once they're fully modded. Fire rate is another place where this can be an issue. Because of status output in Warframe, if weapons do the same damage and have the same status output, a weapon with higher fire rate to do that same damage is a lot stronger because it just outputs more status. Fire rate kind of is status chance a lot of the time, or status output. And the result of this is that weapons that fire fewer times would have to do astronomically more damage to outpace builds that have status built on them. Viral or corrosive is increasing damage by so much when you use it. Weapons would need a lot of damage to make up for that. But if you actually look at the damage values on weapons in Warframe, most faster firing weapons actually do better damage per second, and slower firing single hit weapons do less. I think the effect is that when they do a lot of damage, they feel very overpowered. I'll just let you think about which weapon I might be referring to there. So all of that's not really good or bad as far as I can tell. That's just bad. I personally don't see many advantages there. But the result is that Warframe's difficulty is fairly open-ended. The player's highest power levels can go way above what's needed for the game's hardest difficulty, or rewarding missions, and the variety of difficulties is very large. Even a player at the very end of Warframe could benefit from the rewards from, let's say, a normal Void Fissure, even if they would prefer to do the Steel Path version. And the difference in difficulty between a normal Void Fissure and a Steel Path one is pretty large for most players' accounts. But yeah, they're certainly both reasonably rewarding. So I suppose the result of this generalism is a thing that is both good and bad. This one kind of turned into difficulty, but that's okay. A lot of games with involved build systems use relatively looser difficulty as a way to make decent balance between various options achievable. But I do think that's much more extreme in Warframe than in many other games. Number 3, the Helminth system. Yeah, I mean, this is a system that lets you remove one of your Warframe's 4 abilities and add from a list of curated other frame abilities to replace it. I mean, if you like making builds, it seems like an unambiguous win, right? I'm kind of playing my hand here. You can tell this is one where I just love the Helminth system, but I understand why a lot of people don't. There's kind of 2 big reasons here I'd like to cover. The first one is the idea that some abilities might seem like they monopolize that option. So it might feel like some ability in the Helminth system, I'm sure you can all think of your own ability that you think is obviously the strongest option, it makes it uninteresting to choose for an individual Warframe. This kind of goes back to the second point about how people's different propensities for the feeling of something being worthwhile or powerful enough will determine whether or not they think something is worthwhile. You know, to some extent, you can argue that at a point in a mission, you really don't actually gain anything by doing something stronger. But that isn't necessarily why a lot of people are choosing a certain option. It's just that to them, they want the game to make it so it's hard to pick the single best option because that makes it more interesting. I can relate to that personally. Now, I think that the Helminth system is one of those systems where a lot of people who think there really is only one good option literally just don't understand the merit of the other options. It's not because they have thought about what all the other things could do and they've tried them and they really don't think anything else is useful. I think this is a case where, you know, it's dangerous to get into this territory, but the idea is that people are kind of wrong that there is only one good option. I do think that that's something worth discussing for the Helminth system, but that's another video and a video I've made. But in the first place, I think it's reasonable to be frustrated, feeling like, well, I want, let's say, energy on every Warframe, and I can add it with the Helminth system, so I'm not really choosing. I just sort of put that on every Warframe. And every Warframe might feel like they have a really bad ability that you want to replace anyway. Certainly, I've noticed the phenomenon where if you specialize a build a lot, it does usually make one of a Warframe's 4 abilities literally just bad because you made the stats low or you didn't increase its power in any way. And so it can feel like there's a pretty obvious ability to replace a lot of the time, again, especially for a specific build. And that brings us to the second reason that the Helminth system can bother some people. I just think this is very interesting, even though I personally am not worried about this. It's the idea that the Helminth system means future Warframes are developed with it in mind. They will have an ability that is just phoned in and intended to be replaced because everyone's just going to use the Helminth system to remove it. Cast your mind back with me to the moment the Helminth system released. Even if you didn't play Warframe at this time, imagine that the ability to replace one of a Warframe's abilities with another one was just added to the game, and we haven't had any new Warframes yet. So some people are, at this moment, maybe justifiably concerned that Warframes will have kind of phoned in abilities because the developer assumes you're going to replace one with the Helminth system. Sure, I mean, we hadn't seen any Warframes come out yet, since the system had been added, so it was possible that that would happen, I suppose, in theory. Now, there have been Warframes that have come out since the Helminth system now, and I don't think that they have abilities glaringly obviously intended to be replaced. But the reason I don't think this is something that motivates the developer is kind of a story in and of itself. We got statistics on how many people use certain things in Warframe around the same time. And there were statistics about Warframe usage rates, of course, but there was also this statistic about people using companions. According to this statistic, people that had played a significant amount of Warframe, so you know they were above, I don't really remember, but Mastery Rank 2 or something, used companions. Do you want to guess what percentage of the time? I'll tell you. 50%. 50%? Only 50%? That means 50% of players who've played, you know, okay, Master Rank 2 is not super high, but they do have access to a companion blueprint through the beginning of the star chart. Like, you get one from a junction reward. 50%. Half of all people playing Warframe, you know, beyond the very early levels, weren't using any companion. Not a Kubro, not a Kavat, not a Sentinel, you know, nothing, right? They had no vacuum. Let's just leave it at vacuum for now. I'm not sure I agree that Warframe is a good video game without vacuum. Personally, anyway, I feel like the core of the gameplay is moving around, the flowing, free movement, and picking up loot, either for its combat benefits or to construct literally everything else in the game and progress the content. I don't know. You just have to spend most of the gameplay walking around on the ground, picking stuff up manually. And people worried about wasting energy orbs and stuff, I think that's very minor. Anyway, you probably have so much energy if you're even worried about that. And in the first place, you can avoid picking up loot if you have a vacuum. You just kill enemies from a little bit further away than melee range with, you know, the 1,000 ranged weapons that the game offers. You don't want to play with a companion, that's perfectly fine, by the way. I do just think it's shocking that many people don't use a companion. Frequently when I've brought this statistic up, people insist that it must somehow be wrong. There's no possible way that many people don't use such a core gameplay option. But the reason I bring up this anecdote in the context of the Helminth system and people always using it to replace an ability is to help highlight the fact that most people don't do these things that we accept as just the basic thing that any informed player would do. Most players don't follow communities that discuss different options in these games. Most players don't follow the Reddit. Most players don't watch videos about games. It feels like they do. I know it feels like they do, but the statistics say that is not the case. It's probably higher than it used to be. You know, I remember seeing a statistic that said it's like 80% of players don't engage with any social media about a game. I doubt it's still that high, but apparently it's still pretty high. So it's always good to remember, maybe it's not as widespread as you'd think. So that's why I expect that the Helminth system isn't really designed around. I would be willing to bet that most players do not use it. The developer would know, right? You know, our developers' digital extremes would have statistics that tell them how frequently does a player buy a new Warframe, the non-prime, I know, the horror, and they have the experience of the frame without mods and without a Helminth ability. I bet it's a lot of the time. And so even though it seems like everybody we've spoken to, we have so many examples of people that always use the Helminth system, it's important to remember that in no way indicates that that's the majority, that it probably still is a vocal minority of people. When people claim things like, oh, everybody uses this skill, this is the well-known meta thing, it just isn't. Like, it is not the well-known meta thing, or you don't know that. There's really no way to know that that's the case. And for me, that's the magical thing about the Helminth system. People probably have all sorts of crazy ideas, and we're never going to know what they are. Well, I've had the pleasure of learning what some of your glorious Helminth build ideas are on the streams we've done over the past few years. There's just one more thing. Some people maybe clicked on this video to help them decide if they want to play Warframe. I kind of marketed it, you know, the title and the description set up in a way where I imagine some people are on this video and maybe don't play Warframe. Maybe they like the coverage of other build systems that I've done in other videos, or they're just coming from nowhere in particular. They don't know of this channel. And you're trying to decide, some of you maybe, if this is a game that you'd want to play. What I want to say is that, yeah, this video really was about the things that I think are unique quirks of Warframe's build system, but in particular, a lot of them are quite extreme, right? Many of them are not really good or bad. They're kind of a certain compromise. So I think it's not good at everything. That's kind of my takeaway for you. I wouldn't only play this. I would make sure that you're weaving in another game that you can play alongside it, something else as a sort of palate cleanser or a way to enjoy making builds in a different way. I think that will make this more fun. I know it has for me, so I hope that it will for you. But that would be my recommendation. I don't want to discourage you from playing this game that I think has a lot to offer, a very unique form of making a build. But I definitely don't think that it is unique in that it is uniquely good. It's very unique, very extreme, but maybe not in a way that is purely good. It's just very particular. If that blend works for you, that's great. It will for some of you. But for a lot of you, I think it will be even more rewarding to have played other things too. I hope the rest of my videos are useful to that end. Thanks for listening, folks. Hope you had a good time. See you on the other side.